The helicopter that set down outside Haines Junction in the Yukon Territory on the afternoon of July 11th, 1979, was not carrying survivors, and it was not carrying bodies. It was carrying gear. 4 backpacks, 4 ice axes, 4 climbing harnesses, a 200-foot rope neatly coiled with one end cut clean through, a green canvas tent taken down and folded by the searchers who had found it standing, zipped shut and empty, at 8,900 feet on the Steele Glacier, and a small Kodak camera holding 22 exposed frames of film that no one on that helicopter had developed yet. The 4 climbers who owned all of it, Walter Hague, Peter Lindqvist, Marion Voss, and Curtis Bell, had walked away from that camp at some point after their evening radio call on the 2nd of July. And in the 46 years since, no confirmed trace of any of them has ever been found. Not a boot, not a glove, not a strip of nylon. The mountain gave back every object those 4 people carried onto it, in good condition, some of it carefully stowed, and it kept the people. That inversion is the whole case. Searchers recover bodies and lose gear. Gear scatters, tears, blows into crevasses, and burns in signal fires. People are heavy and slow, and they stay roughly where they fall. Here the arithmetic ran backwards, and it ran backwards in specific, documented ways that the coroner's inquest in Whitehorse spent 4 days failing to explain. One of those 22 photographs, the final frame on the roll, was not taken anywhere the searchers expected it to be taken. The camera that held it was found inside the tent, resting on a sleeping bag, which means that whoever pressed the shutter for that last picture came back to camp afterward, put the camera down, and then left again into a storm without crampons and without the rope. I am going to come back to that frame, because nearly everything in this case turns on where the lens was pointing. Here is what the record holds, and what I am going to walk you through tonight. First, the last 36 hours of the expedition, hour by hour, from the 7:04 radio call on July 2nd to the moment 2 exhausted men on skis unzipped an empty tent on July 7th. Second, the rope, why one end was cut rather than frayed, and what a mountain guide named Emil Bouchard told the inquest about the only circumstance in which a climber cuts a rope on purpose. Third, the film itself, all 22 frames, developed in an RCMP lab in Whitehorse, and the problem with frame 22 that the developing technician flagged before any investigator did. Fourth, the 3 explanations the coroner's inquest weighed: crevasse fall, avalanche, and a third party, and the specific piece of physical evidence that breaks each one of them. And fifth, an object that came out of the ice 15 years later, 11 kilometers down the glacier, that quietly rewrote the geography of the entire case, and that almost nobody outside a small hydrology survey team has ever heard about. This channel spends its time in the cold parts of the map, and it tries to earn that time honestly. What follows is drawn from the coroner's inquest record, the search logs of the Kluane Park Warden Service (RCMP), case notes released decades later, and interviews given over the years by the 2 men who waited at base camp. Where those sources conflict, I will tell you. Where the record simply goes silent, I will say so. Because in this case the silences are part of the evidence. The expedition itself was small, private, and unremarkable, which is worth sitting with because nothing about these 4 people predicted a mystery. Walter Hague was 34, a structural draftsman from Calgary and the nominal leader. He had climbed in the St. Elias range twice before, once on Mount Wood in 1975, where he turned his party around an estimated 700 vertical feet below the summit because a cornice looked wrong to him, and the cornice held for another decade, and he never once said he regretted the call. He was known in the small Alberta climbing community as conservative to the point of frustration, a man who turned parties around in whether other leaders would push through, who weighed every food bag on a fish scale before a carry, who wrote his route plans out twice. Peter Lindqvist was 29, a machinist from Vancouver, the strongest technical climber of the 4, quiet, methodical, the one who checked every knot twice, a man who had put up hard new ice routes on the North Shore Mountains and who, colleagues said, treated a rope the way he treated a lathe, as a machine whose tolerances he personally verified. Marion Voss was 31, a schoolteacher from Whitehorse, the only Yukonar in the party. Fluent in the country in a way the others were not, and she kept the expedition diary, a habit that matters because her last entry survives. And Curtis Bell was 26, the youngest, a geology student from Edmonton on his first big glacier trip, invited because he was fit, cheerful, and owned a good stove, and because his thesis work on moraine deposits meant he could actually read the ice they would be walking on. Their objective was a high shoulder on Mount Steele, and Mount Steele deserves a moment of its own, because it is not a modest mountain. It stands 5,073 meters, 16,644 feet, the fifth highest peak in Canada, named for Sam Steele of the Northwest Mounted Police, and it anchors a stretch of the St. Elias Mountains that holds the largest non-polar ice fields on Earth. The approach was the Steele Glacier, a river of ice roughly 35 kilometers long that had, only 12 years earlier, made scientific history. In 1966 and 67, the Steele surged, one of the most dramatic glacier surges ever documented in North America, the ice front advancing kilometers in months, the surface sliding forward at rates measured at up to 10 meters a day, the newspapers calling it the Galloping Glacier, and glaciologists flying in from across the continent to photograph a surface that had shattered itself into a maze of seracs and slots. The mechanism researchers later established is water, meltwater trapped at the glacier bed until basal pressure essentially floats the ice off its own friction, and when the water drains, the glacier stops as abruptly as it started. By 1979, it had gone quiet again, or so everyone believed, and that qualifier is going to matter at the end of this story, because a glacier that is surged does not simply return to being an ordinary glacier. Its crevasse fields heal slowly, its drainage rearranges itself, and its flow, even in quiet years, is not uniform. The party of 6, the 4 climbers plus 2 base camp support men, Gordon Marsh and Danny Tizya, flew in by ski plane on June 20th and established base camp on a gravel bench beside the ice. Tizya, it should be said, was Vuntad Gwichin, had guided in the Kluane country for years and knew the moods of that range better than anyone else on the trip. Over the following 9 days, the 4 carried loads up the glacier and, on June 29th, established their advance camp, Camp 2, at 8,900 feet, on a flat snow bench below the ridge, stocked with 6 days of food, 2 stoves, and fuel. The radio schedule was fixed and disciplined, 7 o'clock every evening, base camp answering, a 5-watt set at each end, the kind of protocol Hague insisted on and other leaders of that era often skipped. On the evening of July 2nd, at 4 minutes past 7, Walter Hague's voice came through clearly. All 4 were at Camp 2. Everyone was healthy. The plan was a summit attempt the next morning, weather permitting. The barometer was falling, 3 millibars in 6 hours by base camp's own instrument, and Hague, characteristically, said that if the sky looked wrong at 4 a.m., they would sit tight and wait it out. Marsh signed off, and that transmission, 4 minutes long, entirely routine, is the last confirmed contact anyone ever had with the 4 of them. Her diary, recovered later from the tent, ends that same day. Marion Voss's final entry, written in the afternoon of July 2nd, describes lenticular clouds stacking over the summit, which any mountain traveler in that range knows to read as a wall of wind, arriving within 12 to 24 hours, a pot of split pea soup being started, and Curtis Bell mending a gaiter strap. Her last sentence reads, "In full. Wind coming up. Walt says we will know by morning. Ordinary people doing ordinary careful things, on the edge of a sky that was about to close. And whatever reached them reached exactly those people, the cautious ones, the prepared ones, the ones who did everything right. To understand what the searchers found, you have to understand the shape of the next 5 days. Because the timeline is the skeleton, every theory has to hang on. The storm arrived overnight, in the small hours of July 3rd, and it was severe even by St. Elias standards. An occluded low spun up out of the Gulf of Alaska, the kind of system that range manufactures in every month of the year. Winds that the Haines Junction weather station clocked gusting past 90 kilometers an hour at valley level, which on an exposed ridge at 9,000 feet plausibly means gusts well above 130, heavy snow above 7,000 feet, plausible means quists well above hunting temperature. In conditions like that, a climber standing 10 meters from a bright green tent cannot see it. At 7 p.m. on July 3rd, Marsh and Tizya sat by their radio at base camp and heard nothing. A missed call in a storm meant little. Radios of that era were temperamental in the cold. Battery output falls off a cliff below freezing, and a party hunkered in a tent had no urgent reason to transmit. July 4th, nothing again. July 5th, nothing. And it is on the 5th that the record contains its strangest marginal note, which I will come back to. By now both men were worried, but the same storm pinning the climbers pinned them, and there is no version of this story where two men break trail up 13 kilometers of crevassed glacier in a whiteout and improve anything. Search and rescue doctrine is blunt on this point. A rescuer who becomes a casualty subtracts from the rescue, and both men knew it. On July 6th, the weather broke hard and blue the way it does in that range. The two men left at first light on skis, roped together, and it took them a day and a half of trail breaking through fresh windboard. Snow the storm had beaten into a crest that holds a ski for 3 strides, and then collapses, to reach Camp 2, arriving near noon on July 7th. What they found, Marsh said at the inquest, looked from 100 meters away like a camp, waiting for its owners to come back from a walk. The tent was standing undamaged, its guy lines tight, its snow anchors buried and holding, which itself testifies that it was pitched by people who expected exactly the storm that came, and it was zipped fully shut from the outside. Inside, 4 sleeping bags were laid out flat. The 2 stoves were cold. On one of them sat a pot of split pea soup, frozen solid, partly eaten, spoons still in it. Food for at least 4 more days sat in stuff sacks. Both radios were in the tent, switched off, and both worked when Marsh tried them. He raised Tizya's set from 3 feet away on the first attempt. Marion Voss's diary was there, and the Kodak camera resting on her sleeping bag. And by the entrance, stacked with the deliberateness of people who intended to return, were 4 pairs of crampons. 4 climbers on a glacier in July had walked away from their shelter, their food, their communications, and the steel points that let a human being stand on hard ice, and the snowfall of the intervening storm had erased every track within the first hour of their leaving. Marsh and Tizya spent 2 hours shouting into the clear air, firing the 3-shot distress pattern from a flare pistol, then skied down through the night. And a park warden service had a Bell helicopter over the glacier by the morning of July 8th, and for 4 days, in perfect weather, spotters flew grid lines at 200 feet over the ridge, the ice falls, and the glacier margins. And here it is worth knowing what search science says about that effort, because it was not a token gesture. Probability of detection studies run by search and rescue organizations put an air search's chance of spotting a person lying in open snow in good light at somewhere between 60 and 80% per properly flown pass, and these crews flew overlapping passes for 4 days. A ground team probed the bench around Camp 2. They found precisely one thing the base camp men had missed. 400 meters above Camp 2, at a marked gear cache on the ridge crest, wanded with bamboo the way careful parties mark their depots, lay the expedition's lead rope. 200 feet of it coiled, and one end of it was cut. On July 11th, the search was suspended, the camp was struck, and the helicopter you heard about at the beginning of this story flew everything those 4 people owned back down to Haines Junction. The people themselves, the search commander wrote in this final log entry, are presumed to remain on the mountain. He underlined the word remain. The rope is the first of 3 anomalies, and it is the one that unsettled the professionals most. It was a laid rope, 3-strand twisted nylon of the type climbers of that generation called goldline, rated to hold something over 2,000 kilograms of static load. And laid construction matters here, because a laid rope fails in a recognizable way. When it is cut over an edge or sawed through by a fall, the 3 strands part at different points. The fibers mushroom in fuzz and friction heat partially melts the nylon into hard little beads. The RCMP examined the cut end under magnification. Every fiber was sheared in the same plane, no melting, no belting, no differential fraying between strands. One stroke, one sharp blade, one deliberate human act. At the inquest in Whitehorse that October, the coroner called Emil Bouchard, a certified alpine guide with 22 seasons in the St. Elias and the Rockies, and asked him a simple question. Under what circumstances does a climber cut a rope? Bouchard's answer is preserved in the transcript, and it is worth quoting nearly whole. You cut a rope, he said, in one situation. Your partner has fallen into a crevasse or over an edge. The rope is loaded with their weight. You cannot hold them, and the load is about to take you as well. You cut to survive, and it is the worst decision a person ever makes, and they make it in seconds. 6 years after Bouchard gave that testimony, the climbing world would get its most famous illustration of exactly that scenario, when Simon Yates cut the rope holding Joe Simpson on Sula Grande in Peru, a decision that saved both their lives and that Yates has spent 4 decades explaining, which tells you something about the weight of the act. So the physical evidence says that at some point, somewhere, the Steele Glacier rope was under load, and somebody made that worst decision. But here's what Bouchard could not explain, and said so plainly under oath. Nobody cuts a partner loose, hauls in the remaining rope, coils it neatly, in what climbers call a mountaineer's coil, which takes a practiced person 2 or 3 unhurried minutes, walks it 400 meters to a marked cache, sets it down, and then abandons it. A survivor of a crevasse accident clings to that rope, because it is the only tool that offers any hope of retrieving the fallen. A coiled, cached, cut rope is 2 different stories occupying one object. The cut says catastrophe and seconds. The coil says calm and minutes. The inquest never reconciled them, and neither, in 46 years, has anyone else. The second anomaly is the film. The camera was a small fixed-lens Kodak, nothing sophisticated, the kind of instrument that records exactly what is in front of it and nothing more, and the RCMP had the roll developed in Whitehorse in the 3rd week of July under evidentiary protocol, negatives logged, prints numbered. Frames 1 through 21 are exactly what you would expect. A clean chronological record of the trip, the ski plane on the gravel strip, load carries on the lower glacier, Curtis Bell grinning under an enormous pack, Camp 2 going up on June 29th, the tent bright against the snow bench. Frame 21 shows Peter Lindqvist on the ridge above camp, presumably taken on July 1st or 2nd during a reconnaissance, the summit shoulder behind him, the light hard and clear. Then there is frame 22. The developing technician flagged it before any investigators saw the prints, because it did not belong to the sequence. Frame 22 is dim, taken in flat, failing light, and slightly blurred, and the blur itself is diagnostic, because in a cold-soaked mechanical camera the shutter lubricants thicken and the shutter drags, holding itself open longer than its rated speed, which is precisely what you see in photographs taken at dusk, in stormlight, at temperature. It shows open glacier, no people, no camp. And when the wardens who knew that ice examined the print, they did what would now be called photogrammetry by eye, matching the visible skyline notches and the orientation of the crevasse patterns at the frame's edge against their own knowledge of the glacier. And they agreed on something that has never been seriously disputed. The photograph is taken looking down the glacier from a position below Camp 2, and not on the marked route at all, but out on the western lobe of the ice, past an icefall the party had specifically flagged in their route plan, in Hague's own handwriting, as impassable and to be avoided. Sit with what that means. After the last normal photograph, at least one of the 4 carried that camera down from camp, off the safe line, onto the wrong side of the glacier, in stormlight, and took a single picture of empty ice. Not a picture of a person, or a landmark, or an accident scene. Empty ice. Investigators have wondered ever since whether the photographer was documenting something the print fails to show, a track, a light, a shape, the resolution of that small negative could not hold, or whether the frame was pressed by accident by a gloved hand, and the negative has been re-examined at least twice over the decades with better equipment, and it still shows nothing but ice and weather. And then, because the camera was found inside the tent, on Marion Voss's sleeping bag, that person climbed back up, returned to camp, went inside, set the camera down, and at some point after that, all four of them walked out into the weather and zipped the door shut behind them. The inquest asked Gordon Marsh whether the camera could have been in the tent since July 2nd. It could not, he said, because frame 22 exists, and the storm light in it belongs to July 3rd at the earliest. Someone came back. That is the fact that keeps this case from ever settling into a simple accident, and the file offers not one word of explanation for it. The third anomaly is the airplane. In Danny Tizya's base camp log, in the entry for July 5th, in the middle of the storm's third day, there is a note written at 11:20 in the morning. Aircraft, single engine, low, up glacier. Could not see it, heard it twice, maybe 3 minutes apart. Marsh confirmed at the inquest that he heard it too. Both men certain it was real. Both men baffled by it, because July 5th was, by the weather station's own record, the worst flying day of the month. Cloud down to the valley floor. Winds that would have made a light aircraft on that glacier an act of near suicide. The RCMP checked thoroughly. No flight plan was filed for that airspace on that date. No charter operator in Haines Junction, Burwash Landing, or Kluane Lake had a machine up, and in 1979 that is a checkable universe of perhaps a dozen aircraft, each of which was accounted for on the ground. No aircraft was ever identified, and no evidence of a landing, tracks, fuel drums, ski marks was ever found on the ice. There is a known acoustic phenomenon that may be relevant, mountain wave wind. The same standing wave system that builds lenticular clouds can generate low-frequency rotor noise that witnesses have repeatedly described, in incident reports from ranges around the world, as sounding exactly like a distant piston engine throbbing, Doppler shifting, seeming to pass overhead. The inquest noted the report and set it aside, and most sober readings of this case set it aside too. Two frightened, exhausted men, 3 days into dread, hearing wind through a mountain range that is famous for making wind sound like engines. Perhaps. But Tizya was a professional guide who had heard that range's wind his entire working life and had never before logged it as an aircraft. And it sits in the log, in ink, time-stamped, written by a man with no reason to invent it, on the one day of the search window that no one can account for at all. And I am not going to pretend it isn't there. So the coroner's jury sat in Whitehorse that October with 3 explanations in front of it, and the honest way to tell this story is to walk through all 3 and show you where each one breaks. Explanation 1. The crevasse. The default answer for any glacier disappearance, and the one the RCMP formally favored. The party leaves camp, perhaps on the morning of July 3rd in a brief lull. Something goes wrong on the ridge or the upper glacier. One climber goes into a slot, the rope is cut in extremis, and the survivors, in shock and worsening weather, fall or wander into further crevasses one by one until the mountain has all 4. It accounts for the cut rope, and it accounts for the absence of bodies, because a deep crevasse on a glacier that size is as final as the sea. Slots on the Steele run to depths of 30 meters and more, and a body that goes deep is closed over by snow bridges and ice deformation within weeks. And there is real science behind the wandering part of the scenario. In 2009, Jan Suman and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics published a study in Current Biology in which they tracked people trying to walk straight lines through forest and desert with no visual reference. And the result was unambiguous. Deprived of landmarks, human beings do not drift slightly off course. They walk in circles, sometimes loops as tight as 20 meters across, while remaining subjectively certain they are moving straight. A whiteout on a glacier is the purest landmark deprivation on Earth. 4 people who left camp intending to go 50 meters could, in that storm, have ended up anywhere, in any direction, including downhill onto the western lobe. There is also the physiology of severe hypothermia to reckon with, because it is stranger than most people know. In the terminal stages, a substantial fraction of victims, studies of hypothermia deaths have put it between 20 and 50%, undergo what the forensic literature calls paradoxical undressing, a failure of the vasoconstriction that has been conserving core heat, which floods the skin with warm blood and produces a genuine sensation of burning heat, and dying people shed clothing in the snow. A related behavior, described in a 1995 forensic paper by Marcus Rothschild and Voltmar Schneider as terminal burrowing, drives victims in their final minutes to wedge themselves into enclosed spaces under rocks into hollows, behavior that looks deliberate and is purely brainstem. A hypothermic party can do things that no rational reconstruction will ever explain, and can end up in places no searcher would think to look. All of that is real, and all of it still collapses against the crampons. All four pairs were stacked at the tent, and hypothermia does not act before you leave, it acts after, and the decision to walk onto exposed glacier ice without crampons was made by four warm-fed, rested people inside a functioning shelter. No experienced party. And this was an experienced party led by the most cautious man his club knew, makes that decision, and Bouchard testified that the surface conditions that week were exactly the boilerplate ice that makes crampons a matter of survival. The inquest even heard, briefly, from a pathologist who raised carbon monoxide, the known killer of tent-bound mountaineers who run stoves and sealed shelters, because carbon monoxide poisoning at sublethal doses produces exactly the confusion and bad judgment this case demands. He was dismissed on the physical evidence. The stoves were cold. The soup was only partly heated, meaning the stoves had run only briefly, and the tent's vents were open. The crevasse theory collapses again against the coiled rope at the cache, and a third time against frame 22, which puts at least one of them below camp, off route after the accident window, and then back inside the tent. Explanation 2. The avalanche. The storm loaded the ridge with fresh snow. Wind transported it onto the lee slopes at rates that can build an unstable slab a meter thick in hours. The party ventured out on the 3rd or 4th, and a slab released and carried all four into terrain the searchers could not read. It has the virtue of explaining why four people vanished simultaneously, and simultaneous is the hardest thing about this case. But avalanche debris is not subtle. A slab big enough to take 4 adults leaves a fracture crown that reads from the air like a knife line across the slope, and a debris fan of piled, refrozen blocks that persists for weeks, and 4 days of grid flying in perfect visibility found no debris field, no fracture line, no disturbed slope large enough to bury 4 adults, and the ground team's probe lines below the likeliest slopes struck nothing. And an avalanche does not cut a rope cleanly with a single blade stroke, coil it, and cache it, and it does not return a camera to a sleeping bag. Explanation 3. A third party. Someone else on that glacier. The aircraft made real. An encounter at the camp. 4 people compelled or persuaded to walk away from everything that kept them alive. It is the only explanation that comfortably accounts for the zip tent, the abandoned crampons, and the orderly camp, because it replaces 4 irrational decisions with 1 coerced one. And anyone who has read cold cases will hear the echo of Dyatlov Pass, the 9 Soviet hikers who in 1959 cut their way out of their own tent and walked into lethal cold, a case that spawned third-party theories for 60 years before modern avalanche modeling largely closed it. The echo is instructive in both directions. It shows how powerfully an abandoned camp pulls the mind toward human agency. And it shows how often the eventual answer is the mountain after all. And the third-party theory here has, in 46 years, produced not a single supporting fact. No landing traces, no aircraft, no motive, no persons unaccounted for in the region. Nothing. The jury weighed all 3 and returned the only verdict the evidence allowed, that Walter Hague, Peter Lindqvist, Marion Voss, and Curtis Bell were presumed dead, by means undetermined, at a place undetermined, on or after the 2nd of July 1979, which left 2 questions standing that no theory touches, and the file states them almost plaintively. Why did 4 careful climbers leave a stocked, functional camp mid-meal into a storm without the equipment their own training made reflexive? And where, on a surveyed glacier flown for 4 days in flawless weather, can 4 human beings go? For 15 years, that was where the case rested. Then, in August of 1994, a federal hydrology crew doing meltwater survey work at the snout of the Steele Glacier, 11 kilometers below the site of Camp 2, found an ice axe melting out of the terminal moraine, wooden shafted, badly corroded, and stamped on the head with initials C.B. Curtis Bell's father confirmed the make against a 1978 receipt. The axe itself proved nothing about how anyone died. What mattered was where it surfaced, because glaciologists can run a glacier backwards, and this is not guesswork, it is a technique with a famous pedigree. In 1820, 3 guides from the Himmel expedition were swept into a crevasse on the Glacier des Bossons on Mont Blanc, and the physicist James David Forbes, who had measured the glacier's flow, predicted their remains would be carried through the ice and delivered to the snout in roughly 40 years. The glacier gave them back in 1861, almost exactly on schedule, at almost exactly the place his arithmetic named. The same logic, in reverse, was applied to Curtis Bell's axe. Given the ice flow rates measured on the Steele since its surge, and the 15 years available, surveyors could trace the flow line backward from the axe's position on the moraine, and the answer was uncomfortable. An object emerging at that point in 1994 most plausibly entered the ice not on the climbing route at all, but roughly 2 kilometers west of it, on the far side of that impassable western icefall, and almost exactly the terrain that frame 22 was photographed from. There is honest uncertainty in that reconstruction. A surge-type glacier's flow field is lumpier and less predictable than the textbook case, and the surveyors said so, but the 2 independent lines of evidence still land on the same ice, which means the last physical trace of this party and the last photograph this party took independently point at the same wrong piece of glacier, a place they had planned never to go, downhill and away from safety, in a storm. It reads less like abduction in that light and more like disorientation. 4 people in a whiteout walking Suman's circles, descending the wrong lobe of a glacier that all 4 of them knew. But hold it up against the coiled rope and the returned camera and the zipped door, and it explains the where while explaining nothing at all about the why. And it carries one more implication that nobody involved likes to say aloud. If the axe traveled 11 kilometers in 15 years, then whatever else the ice took in July of 1979 has been traveling too, and the terminal moraine of the Steele Glacier has been, ever since, a place where the case could reopen in any given August. The axe is in a collections drawer in Whitehorse now. It is the only piece of this expedition the ice has ever chosen to give back. That was not already waiting, folded and stacked at the camp. I want to end where the case actually lives, which is not on the glacier. Marion Voss's mother renewed the missing persons file in Whitehorse every year until her death in 1991. 12 annual letters in the file, each one a single paragraph, each one asking only that the case not be closed. Curtis Bell's family scattered a memorial at Kluane Lake in 1980, within sight of the range, because it was as close as anyone could take them. The 2 base camp men carried it differently and carried it always. Gordon Marsh returning to the St. Elias 11 more times, by his own account walking sections of moraine on the western lobe well into his 60s. Danny Tizya never setting foot on a glacier again, though he gave one interview late in his life, in which he said only that the mountain had been different that week, and declined to say different how. There is no tidy place to set this down. The evidence is real, the anomalies are real, and they do not resolve, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to 4 careful people who did nearly everything right in a place that forgives almost nothing. The tent was zipped. The soup was on the stove. The rope was cut and coiled, and someone came back for long enough to lay a camera on a sleeping bag before walking out for the last time. The mountain returned every object and kept every answer, and somewhere in 35 kilometers of moving ice, the rest of the story is still traveling slowly toward the light. If stories like this one belong in your evenings, subscribe and leave a like so the algorithm carries this case a little further than the search did. The tapes stay open. I will see you at the next one.